The distant silhouette of longships appears through the morning mist on the River Seine. It is the year 845, and the waterway that has long been the lifeblood of Frankish commerce is about to become its greatest vulnerability. The ships move with eerie precision, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the water like predators stalking prey. At their helm stand men whose reputation has begun to echo throughout Christendom: Norsemen, seafarers from the cold north. The Franks, proud inheritors of Roman culture and Charlemagne's glory, had dismissed these men as crude barbarians in simple homespun clothes. Now those same barbarians approach the heart of Frankish power, and Paris is about to learn a devastating lesson in underestimating one's enemy. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. In the early 9th century, the Frankish Empire stood as the dominant power in Western Europe. Under Charlemagne and his successors, the Carolingians had created what many considered the restoration of Roman greatness, an empire of unprecedented scale and ambition. Their courts glittered with precious metals and fine textiles. Their monasteries preserved ancient learning. Their churches rose in stone, monuments to God and Frankish might. In Paris and Aachen, nobles dressed in Byzantine silks and Moorish fabrics, adorning themselves with intricate jewelry that proclaimed their status to all who beheld them. The Frankish aristocracy had developed a deeply ingrained sense of cultural superiority, one that measured civilization through its refinements, its luxuries, and its distance from the simple necessities of survival. The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians would later call it, had transformed the Frankish lands from a collection of post-Roman kingdoms into the cultural and political center of Western Christendom. Charlemagne himself had been crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800, a ceremony that symbolically linked his realm to the glory of ancient Rome. His court at Aachen attracted scholars from across Europe, men like Alcuin of York and Einhard, whose writings preserved not only the achievements of their patron, but also their sense of participating in a great civilizational revival. In their eyes, and in the eyes of the Frankish elite who followed them, refinement in dress, speech, and manners served as visible markers of this cultural ascendancy. The material culture of the Carolingian world reflected this preoccupation with status and display. Archaeological discoveries from this period reveal an aristocracy invested in visible wealth, gold and silver jewelry, weapons with ornate hilts and pommels, and textiles dyed with expensive imported pigments. A Frankish noble at court might wear a silk tunic with embroidered borders, a cloak fastened with a jeweled brooch, and leather shoes dyed in bright colors. Women of the aristocracy adorned themselves with gold filigree earrings, necklaces of amber and crystal, and rings on multiple fingers. These weren't merely personal preferences, they were statements of identity, signifiers that placed the wearer within a specific social hierarchy. Far to the north, across the cold waters of what we now call the North Sea, a different world existed. The Scandinavian peninsula and its surrounding regions, what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, were lands shaped by harsh necessity. Here, the growing season was short, the winters long, and survival demanded practicality above all else. In these northern settlements, clothing was valued first for warmth and durability. Simple woolen tunics, trousers of rough-spun cloth, and cloaks fastened with functional brooches. These were the garments of a people for whom ostentation was an unaffordable luxury. Yet what the Scandinavians lacked in sartorial extravagance, they more than compensated for in shipbuilding prowess and warrior culture. The Norse homeland was a landscape of dramatic contrasts: towering mountains and deep fjords in Norway, dense forests and countless lakes in Sweden, low-lying plains, and protective inlets in Denmark. These varied environments fostered regional differences in lifestyle and economy, but all shared the fundamental challenge of wresting survival from a demanding climate. Archaeological excavations at sites like Jorvik, modern York, Dublin, and Hedeby have yielded remarkably preserved textiles that tell us much about Viking clothing. Most garments were made from wool, with linen reserved for undergarments worn by those who could afford them. Colors came from natural dyes, woad for blue, madder for red, various plants and lichens for yellows and greens. While not as vibrant as the imported dyes available to the Franks, these homegrown colors allowed for a degree of personalization and status differentiation even within a generally practical wardrobe. Life in the north revolved around the sea. Unlike the Franks, who had largely abandoned maritime traditions after the fall of Rome, the Norse people had perfected their relationship with the ocean. Their villages nestled in protective fjords, their livelihood dependent on fishing and coastal trade. Their religious cosmology spoke of a world born from ice and fire, a universe filled with gods who embodied the forces of nature they encountered daily. Odin, the All-Father, wandered in search of wisdom. Thor protected mankind with his mighty hammer. Freya presided over both love and war, and Loki, the trickster, represented chaos and unpredictability, much like the sea itself. When Norsemen died bravely in battle, they believed the Valkyries would carry them to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of all things. The Norse religion permeated every aspect of daily life, from the naming of children to the layout of settlements. Archaeological evidence from pre-Christian Scandinavia reveals a rich symbolic world expressed through carved runes, decorative metalwork, and ritual deposits. The Oseberg ship burial discovered in Norway offers a glimpse into the material wealth that could be assembled by elite Norse families. A magnificent vessel accompanied by exquisitely carved wooden objects, textiles, and the remains of sacrificed animals. Yet even in death, practicality remained central to Norse values. The objects placed in graves were typically functional items that the deceased might need in the afterlife: weapons for men, household tools for women, personal items for both. The symbolic value of these grave goods lay not in their ostentatious display, but in their utility for the journey beyond. The Viking ship was the technological marvel that would bridge these two worlds. Nothing in medieval Europe could compare to the versatility and efficiency of the longship. With a shallow draft that allowed navigation in waters just 3 feet deep, these vessels could travel up rivers far inland, then be beached directly on shore without need for harbors. Their flexible oak construction allowed them to ride ocean waves without breaking. Most critically, their combination of sail and oar power meant they could move regardless of wind conditions. When the breeze favored them, they unfurled striped woolen sails to harness its power. When the air fell still, they deployed rows of oarsmen to maintain momentum. The Frankish chronicler Ermoldus Nigellus would later write with reluctant admiration that these ships moved like birds upon the water, a simile that captured both their grace and the terror they inspired. The construction of a Viking longship represented the pinnacle of Norse craftsmanship. Shipwrights selected oak trees with natural curves for the stem and stern posts, using the inherent strength of the wood's grain to create vessels that could flex without breaking. The planking was split rather than sawn, preserving the wood's natural strength, and overlapped in a clinker-built design that distributed stress across the entire hull. Iron rivets secured the planks to the frame, each one individually forged by skilled blacksmiths. A single large vessel might require thousands of these rivets, representing a substantial investment in skilled labor and precious metal. The sails themselves, woven from wool on upright looms, required months of work by skilled weavers, usually women. The ropes were twisted from local materials, linden bast fibers or animal hair. Every component reflected a culture that valued functional excellence over decorative excess. The contrast with Frankish shipbuilding could not have been more stark. By the 9th century, maritime technology in Francia had stagnated. River transport relied on flat-bottomed barges with minimal maneuverability, while sea travel was limited to coastal hugging in vessels ill-equipped for open water. The Franks had inherited the Roman preference for roads over waterways, investing in land infrastructure at the expense of naval development. This technological gap would prove decisive when the two cultures collided, giving the Vikings an almost supernatural ability to appear without warning and vanish before effective resistance could be mounted. What drove the Norsemen to venture beyond their northern homes? For generations, historians debated this question. Was it population pressure on limited arable land? Climate shifts that reduced harvest yields? Political consolidation that drove defeated chieftains to seek fortune elsewhere? Modern scholarship suggests a complex interplay of all these factors. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia had experienced several generations of relative population growth. At the same time, the first attempts to create unified kingdoms were underway, particularly in Denmark and parts of Norway. For ambitious men who found themselves on the losing side of these power struggles, the sea offered an escape and an opportunity. The longship transformed geographic barriers into highways, making distant shores accessible as never before. Recent archaeological research has added another dimension to this narrative. Analysis of ice cores from Greenland indicates a period of relatively warm climate across northern Europe from approximately 800 to 1000 CE. This medieval warm period would have extended growing seasons in Scandinavia, potentially supporting larger populations than previous or subsequent eras. Paradoxically, this population growth may have increased pressure on available resources, as more people competed for limited arable land. At the same time, the warmer climate would have made sea voyages less hazardous by reducing the frequency of storms and sea ice. The combination of push factors, population pressure, political consolidation, and pull factors, improved sailing conditions, knowledge of wealthy targets abroad, created the perfect conditions for expansion. The first recorded Viking raid on Frankish territory occurred in 799, when Norse ships attacked the island monastery of Noirmoutier near the mouth of the Loire River. For the Franks, this was merely a troubling curiosity, a strange incident from the distant periphery. But over the next 3 decades, these raids increased in frequency and ambition. By the 820s, Viking fleets were penetrating deeper into Frankish territory each season, following the Seine, Loire, and Garonne rivers inland. The pattern was always the same: swift attacks, the seizure of portable wealth, and a rapid retreat before local forces could organize resistance. The Frankish response to these early incursions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the threat they faced. Emperor Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son and successor, initially treated Viking raids as a diplomatic problem rather than a military one. In 826, he welcomed the Danish chieftain Harald Klak to his palace at Ingelheim, serving as godfather when Harald accepted baptism. The emperor evidently hoped that Christianization would civilize the Northmen and end their depredations. It was a strategy that reflected both Christian missionary zeal and Frankish cultural arrogance, the belief that exposure to Frankish refinement would naturally lead the Vikings to abandon their barbaric ways. When the raids continued unabated, Louis ordered coastal defenses improved and deployed warships at major river mouths, but these measures proved insufficient against enemies who could strike anywhere along a vast coastline. When Norsemen and Franks encountered one another, the cultural disconnect was immediate and profound. The Franks, with their elaborate court ceremonies and rigid social hierarchies, viewed the Vikings as uncouth savages. Frankish clerics described them as unwashed pagans and men of filthy habit. The simple woolen garments of the Norsemen became a particular focus of Frankish mockery. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, described with thinly veiled contempt how a group of Norsemen appeared at court. They came in their customary dress, which differs little from the clothes of beggars, rough tunics of undyed wool, trousers bound with simple thongs, and hair cut in the manner of peasants. To the status-conscious Frankish nobility, such simplicity in dress indicated poverty of both means and culture. The Annals of Saint Bertin, one of our most important sources for this period, records an incident that encapsulates this cultural misunderstanding. In 831, a delegation of Danish nobles visited the court of Louis the Pious to negotiate a treaty. The Frankish courtiers, according to the chronicler, laughed openly at the coarse garments of these northern men who wore no silks nor gold embroidery, but only wool and leather. One nobleman reportedly jested that these men dress like our shepherds, yet expect to be treated as our equals. The Danish delegates, though fluent enough in the Frankish tongue to conduct negotiations, apparently did not understand these asides, or chose to ignore them. The treaty was concluded successfully, but the cultural chasm revealed by this episode would have profound consequences in the years to come. What the Franks failed to understand was that Viking clothing represented a different set of values. The woolen garments they derided offered superior protection against cold and wet conditions at sea. The simple leather shoes and boots allowed sure footing on slick ship decks. Even Viking hairstyles, often shaved at the back and sides but longer on top, combined practicality with cultural identity. Most importantly, while the Norsemen might dress simply, they lavished attention on their weapons and ships. A Viking warrior might wear a plain tunic, but his sword, pattern welded from multiple grades of iron and steel, with a hilt sometimes inlaid with silver or bronze, represented a small fortune in craftsmanship. The Frankish focus on outward displays of wealth blinded them to the deadly practical efficiency of Viking culture. Evidence from both archaeological findings and written sources indicates that the Vikings themselves were well aware of the Frankish perception of their clothing. The saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, though compiled centuries later, preserves what may be a cultural memory of this dynamic. In one episode, Ragnar deliberately adopts rough clothing before meeting with foreign kings, explaining to his companions that they will underestimate men dressed as we are, thinking us poor and therefore weak. Whether historical or literary, this passage suggests that Norse warriors may have strategically exploited Frankish prejudices, using their simple appearance to encourage complacency in their adversaries. The cultural misunderstanding ran deeper than clothing. The Franks, with their Roman-influenced mindset, expected wars to follow certain conventions, formal declarations, pitched battles between armies, and clear political objectives. Viking raids, by contrast, struck without warning, targeted the defenseless as readily as the armed, and withdrew before a confrontation when possible. What the Franks interpreted as cowardice was in fact a coldly rational approach to combat. The Vikings understood that their comparative advantage lay in mobility and surprise, not in matching the Frankish heavy cavalry on open battlefields. This fundamental disconnect in understanding war would have devastating consequences as the Viking Age progressed. Frankish military organization had evolved from late Roman models into a system centered on mounted warriors. By the 9th century, the core of Frankish armies consisted of armored horsemen equipped with lance and sword, supported by infantry levies drawn from the peasantry. Military service was tied to land ownership, with nobles obligated to provide specified numbers of fighters based on their holdings. This system excelled at delivering concentrated force to decisive points on a battlefield, but struggled against enemies who refused to engage on such terms. The heavy cavalry that formed the elite of Frankish armies required extensive training and expensive equipment, another arena where the Franks prioritized display alongside function. Horse trappings, helmets, and sword hilts became canvases for artistic expression, markers of status as much as tools of war. Viking military organization, by contrast, emphasized individual prowess within a flexible group structure. While chieftains and kings certainly existed, the typical Norse raiding party operated with a flatter hierarchy than Frankish forces. Each warrior was expected to provide his own weapons and armor, creating an army of self-equipped fighters rather than centrally supplied troops. This system produced combatants with deep personal investment in their equipment, men who understood their weapons intimately because they had either made them themselves or commissioned them directly from craftsmen they knew. The result was a force that combined individual initiative with collective action in ways that repeatedly confounded Frankish defenders. By the early 840s, the Frankish Empire had entered a period of internal crisis. Following the death of Louis the Pious in 840, his three sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, plunged the realm into civil war. Their conflict culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided the once unified empire into three kingdoms. It was into this atmosphere of political fragmentation that a Viking fleet of unprecedented size sailed up the Seine River in the spring of 845. At its head was a leader whose name would become legendary, Ragnar. The identity of this Ragnar remains contested by historians. Was he the same Ragnar who raided Paris and later died in a snake pit according to Norse sagas? Or was he simply a powerful chieftain whose deeds became conflated with legendary accounts? What we know with certainty is that in March of 845, a fleet of 120 longships carrying perhaps 5,000 warriors entered the Seine estuary and began moving upstream toward Paris. Towns and monasteries along the river were plundered in rapid succession. Frankish attempts to resist were swept aside. By Easter, the Viking fleet had reached Paris itself. The journey up the Seine would have taken approximately 2 weeks, allowing ample time for word of the approaching fleet to reach Paris. Charles the Bald, the newly established king of West Francia, attempted to organize resistance at Rouen, but the defensive force was overwhelmed. According to the Annals of Saint-Bertin, the king gathered an army against the Northmen at the monastery of Saint-Denis, but his men accomplished nothing useful. This terse assessment hides what must have been a chaotic scramble to assemble forces from a kingdom still reeling from civil war. Local counts, responsible for regional defense, found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties, the need to protect their own territories, and the obligation to join the royal army. Many chose the former, leaving Charles with insufficient forces to confront the Viking host directly. Paris in 845 was not yet the grand capital we know today. Its importance lay primarily in its location on the Seine and its religious significance as home to the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The city proper was confined largely to the Île de la Cité, a natural island in the middle of the river with settlements spreading onto both banks. As the Viking ships appeared on the horizon, panic spread through the population. Charles the Bald, the Frankish king responsible for this region, had gathered what forces he could at Saint-Denis to the north, but they were insufficient to confront the Viking host directly. Archaeological excavations on the Île de la Cité have revealed traces of 9th century fortifications, but these were modest compared to the massive stone walls that would encircle Paris in later centuries. The defenses that existed were primarily designed to repel small-scale attacks or control river traffic, not to withstand a determined assault by thousands of warriors. The city's religious institutions, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, in its pre-Gothic incarnation, on the island, the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés on the left bank, and numerous smaller churches, represented both the spiritual heart of the region and its greatest concentrations of portable wealth. Their vulnerable position made them prime targets for Viking raiders. The sight of Paris from the river must have presented a tempting target to the Norsemen. Here stood stone churches with lead roofs, monasteries filled with gold and silver religious objects, and markets containing the wealth of Frankish commerce. More importantly, here was the symbolic heart of Frankish power in the region, a prize whose fall would echo throughout Christendom. On Easter Sunday, as the faithful gathered for the most sacred day in the Christian calendar, Ragnar's forces struck. According to the Annals of Saint-Bertin, the Northmen sailed up the Seine to Paris with impunity, and on Easter Sunday, March 28th, they entered the city. Charles the Bald attempted to offer some resistance, but he was unable to oppose any effective obstacle, and so they pillaged and burned the city and carried off into captivity all its inhabitants who had not fled at their approach. Contemporary accounts describe the horror that unfolded as the Viking ships beached along the riverbanks. The monk of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who may have witnessed the events firsthand, wrote that the pagans came like wolves among sheep, with nothing to stop their advance. He described how the Norse warriors moved through the city like a scythe through grain, taking all that could be carried and burning what could not. The Norsemen showed particular interest in churches and monasteries, where they found concentrated wealth in the form of gold and silver liturgical objects. Reliquaries containing the remains of saints, gospel books with jeweled covers, chalices, and patens used in the Mass, all were seized as plunder, their religious significance meaningless to the pagan raiders except as measures of value. The sack of Paris unfolded with ruthless efficiency. The Vikings showed particular interest in the religious establishments, not out of any specific animosity toward Christianity, but because churches and monasteries concentrated wealth in predictable locations. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which lay just outside the city proper, suffered particularly heavy losses. Its treasury of gold and silver liturgical objects, chalices, reliquaries, gospel covers studded with precious stones, represented generations of pious donations. To the monks who had created and safeguarded these treasures, they were sacred vessels for divine worship. To the Vikings, they were portable wealth to be melted down for silver weight. Contemporary Frankish accounts describe the horror in vivid terms. The monk of Saint-Germain-des-Prés wrote of pagans dressed in simple clothes but carrying deadly weapons, who mocked our finest garments while stealing everything of value. Another chronicler described how men in rough garb took delight in burning our silks and linens. The contrast between Viking simplicity and the objects of their plunder became a recurrent theme in Frankish writings, a way to process the cultural shock of seeing their refined civilization vulnerable to men they had dismissed as unsophisticated. The destruction extended beyond material losses. According to several sources, the Vikings took particular pleasure in desecrating Christian sacred spaces. They reportedly used chalices as drinking vessels, wore priestly vestments as cloaks, and stabled their horses in church naves. Whether these accounts reflect actual events or are embellishments designed to emphasize the pagans' sacrilegious nature is difficult to determine. What is certain is that the psychological impact of the raid went far beyond its material damage. For the Franks, the violation of their holy places on the most sacred day of the Christian calendar represented a spiritual catastrophe as much as a military defeat. As smoke rose from burning buildings on the Ile de la Cité, Charles the Bald faced a humiliating decision. Unable to defeat the Viking force militarily, he entered into negotiations to pay them to leave. After extensive haggling, a danegeld of 7,000 pounds of silver, an astronomical sum for the time, was agreed upon. The payment represented more than just treasure. It was a devastating acknowledgment of Frankish vulnerability. Those simple-dressed men from the north, so long mocked for their lack of refinement, had exposed the hollow center of Frankish power. The logistics of assembling such an enormous payment must have been challenging. Church treasuries were raided once again, this time by Frankish authorities rather than Viking invaders. Noble families were required to contribute based on their wealth. Even with these emergency measures, it reportedly took weeks to gather the full amount. During this time, the Viking force remained camped near Paris, a constant reminder of the new power dynamic. Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, whose empire had once dominated Western Europe, was reduced to buying peace from raiders his grandfathers would have dismissed as insignificant barbarians. The Vikings withdrew down the Seine with their plunder, but not before making a final statement. According to several chroniclers, Ragnar executed a number of captive Frankish nobles hanging them from trees along the riverbank, where their fine clothes, now tattered and soiled, fluttered in the breeze like grim pennants. Whether this detail is historical fact or later embellishment, it captures the symbolic inversion that had occurred. The finery that had once signified Frankish superiority now marked their humiliation. The psychological aftermath of the raid extended far beyond Paris. News of the city's fall spread rapidly throughout the Frankish realms, carried by fleeing refugees and official messengers alike. For a civilization that had defined itself through continuity with Roman order, the sack of a major city by barbarians evoked disturbing parallels to the fall of Rome itself. The annals of Fulda record that fear of the Northmen spread throughout the Western Kingdom, such that men believed the end times were upon them. This apocalyptic interpretation was reinforced by the timing of the attack on Easter Sunday, which many saw as a deliberate assault on Christianity itself, rather than a coincidental choice based on practical considerations. Some Frankish clerics interpreted the Viking raids as divine punishment for the sins of their people. Paschasius Radbertus, a prominent theologian, wrote that God has unleashed the men of the north upon us because we have turned from his ways. This perspective placed responsibility for the disaster not on Frankish military weakness or Viking strength, but on moral and spiritual failings. While convenient as an explanation that preserved Frankish self-image, it also contained a kernel of truth. The internal divisions and civil wars that had weakened the Frankish realms certainly represented a departure from the unity that Christian teaching advocated. In the aftermath of the 845 raid, a profound shift occurred in Frankish perception of the Vikings. No longer were they dismissed as mere barbarians in simple dress. The Edict of Meersen, issued by Charles the Bald in 847, ordered the construction of fortified bridges across rivers to impede Viking ships and established a system of beacons to warn of approaching raiders. Monasteries began relocating their treasures inland and constructing defensive walls. Most tellingly, Frankish writers stopped mocking Viking appearance and began describing them in terms that betrayed a new respect tinged with fear. The annals of Saint-Bertin, which had previously characterized the Northmen primarily in terms of their paganism and crude appearance, now described them as exceedingly skilled in war and cunning beyond other men. Hincmar of Rheims, who continued the annals after 861, wrote that though they wear no fine garments, the Northmen possess a terrible efficiency in all they do. This change in perception marked a crucial development. The Franks had begun to recognize that beneath the simple exterior of Viking culture lay a formidable effectiveness that their own society, for all its refinement, struggled to match. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests that the change in Frankish attitude may have extended to practical adaptations. Excavations at several Frankish sites dating to the mid-9th century have uncovered weapons and tools that show Norse influence in their design. These include axe heads with elongated blades similar to Viking models and ship fittings that incorporate Scandinavian techniques. While the sample size remains too small for definitive conclusions, these artifacts hint at a pragmatic willingness to adopt useful elements from the culture that had proven so formidable in battle. The sack of Paris was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of an intensified phase of Viking activity in Francia. Throughout the 850s and 860s, Norse fleets returned repeatedly to the Seine, Loire, and other rivers. They established winter bases on islands and peninsulas, extending their reach and duration. Some Viking leaders began to seek not just plunder but territory, recognizing the rich agricultural potential of Frankish lands compared to their northern homes. In 858, a Viking force seized the city of Noyon and captured Bishop Immo, holding him for ransom. By the early 860s, they had established a major base on the Seine at Jeufosse, from which they could strike deeper into Frankish territory. These developments marked a significant evolution in Viking strategy. The earlier pattern of raid and retreat was giving way to a more persistent presence, what modern military analysts might call Forward positioning. By maintaining bases within Frankish territory, Viking forces gained several advantages. They reduced the logistical challenges of launching raids from Scandinavia, allowing them to strike multiple targets with minimal preparation. They gained intimate knowledge of local geography and defenses through continuous observation. Perhaps most importantly, they established a psychological presence that kept Frankish communities in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when or where the next attack might come. For the Franks, these incursions forced a painful reassessment of their military and political strategies. The heavy cavalry that had been the backbone of Frankish military power since Charlemagne proved ineffective against enemies who refused to engage in conventional battles and who could appear and disappear along waterways with startling speed. Frankish nobles, accustomed to displays of martial prowess through ornate weapons and armor displayed in formal contests, found themselves facing adversaries who valued lethal efficiency over ornamental display. Charles the Bald responded with a series of reforms designed to counter the Viking threat. The Capitulary of Servais, issued in 853, reorganized local defense systems and clarified the responsibilities of regional counts for protecting their territories. Charles also began constructing fortified bridges at key river crossings, permanent structures with stone foundations and wooden superstructures that included defensive towers and narrow passages to prevent Viking ships from passing. The remains of one such bridge, discovered by archaeologists at Pont de l'Arche near Rouen, reveal sophisticated engineering that combined Roman techniques with innovations developed specifically to counter the Norse threat. The cultural impact extended beyond military matters. As the Viking threat became a persistent feature of Frankish life, attitudes toward material display began to shift. Archaeological evidence from this period shows changes in elite burial practices, fewer ostentatious grave goods, and more practical items. Frankish fashion itself evolved, with some evidence suggesting that more practical northern-influenced styles began to appear in regions with frequent Viking contact. When a Frankish noble named Robert the Strong was appointed to defend the region between the Seine and Loire rivers against Viking incursions, he reportedly set aside his fine court garments for simpler attire more suited to constant readiness for battle. His example was followed by other frontier lords, creating what one chronicler described as a new breed of Frankish warrior, more concerned with effectiveness than appearance. While this shift should not be overstated, Frankish aristocratic culture remained deeply invested in visible displays of status. It represents a significant adaptation in response to the Viking threat. The very nobles who had once mocked the simple dress of the Norsemen were now, perhaps unconsciously, adapting elements of their practical approach. The Annals of Saint-Bertin record an illustrative incident from 861. Behind the clash of cultures lay deeper historical currents. The Vikings, for all their seeming savagery to Frankish eyes, were entering a phase of expanding horizons and cultural dynamism. The same decades that saw the raids on Paris also witnessed Norse exploration westward to Iceland, the establishment of trading posts along the Baltic, and the beginnings of the Rus state in what would become Russia. Far from being simple barbarians, the Vikings were adaptable innovators whose networks would eventually span from Newfoundland to the Caspian Sea. This broader context helps explain why the Vikings proved so formidable, despite their relative lack of formal political organization. They were not simply raiders, but participants in a rapidly expanding economic system. Dendrochronological dating of Viking-era docks and warehouses at sites like Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang reveals substantial investment in commercial infrastructure during precisely the period when the raids on Francia intensified. The seeming contradiction, sophisticated traders who also engaged in plunder, makes sense when we recognize that the Vikings approached both activities with the same pragmatic focus on results. Trade and raid represented complementary strategies for acquiring wealth to be deployed as circumstances dictated. The Franks, conversely, were experiencing the painful dissolution of Charlemagne's imperial vision. The Treaty of Verdun had formalized the division of his realm, but political fragmentation continued apace. By the 860s, local counts and dukes were increasingly asserting independence from royal authority, building private fortifications, and maintaining personal military retinues. This feudalization process was accelerated by the Viking threat, as central authorities proved unable to provide security and local protectors filled the void. The magnificent court culture of Charlemagne's era, with its emphasis on Roman revival and imperial grandeur, was giving way to a more localized, defensive mentality. The cultural narrative that had defined the earliest Viking-Frankish encounters, refined civilization versus crude barbarians, had by now collapsed entirely. In its place emerged a more complex relationship, one that would ultimately transform both societies. The Franks began to respect Norse martial prowess, while the Vikings increasingly appreciated the wealth and sophistication of Frankish culture. This mutual recognition would eventually open pathways to integration that few could have imagined in the smoking ruins of Paris in 845. Evidence of this cultural cross-fertilization appears in multiple sources. The Annals of St. Vaast note that by the 870s, some Viking leaders had adopted Frankish customs of dress when they came to negotiate, suggesting a strategic adaptation to facilitate diplomatic interaction. Conversely, the Chronicle of Regino of Prum mentions Frankish warriors who wore their hair in the northern style and favored axes over swords in battle, clear indicators of Norse influence. Material culture tells a similar story. Jewelry from this period often combines Frankish decorative techniques with Norse motifs, creating hybrid styles that reflected the increasingly complex relationship between the two societies. The religious dimension of this cultural encounter adds another layer of complexity. To the Christian Franks, the pagan beliefs of the Vikings represented a fundamental division, a marker of otherness that reinforced their perception of Norse inferiority. Yet even this boundary began to blur as the 9th century progressed. Some Viking leaders accepted baptism, either out of genuine conversion or as a political strategy to facilitate relations with Frankish authorities. The Annals of Saint-Bertin record that in 862, a Danish chieftain named Wieland received the faith of Christ along with his family and retainers, after which he fought alongside Frankish forces against other Viking bands. While such conversions often proved temporary or superficial, they created points of cultural contact that complicated the simple opposition of Christian and pagan. The next major turning point in this cultural encounter came in 885-886, when a massive Viking force estimated at between 10,000 and 40,000 warriors laid siege to Paris. This was no mere raid, but a determined attempt to capture the city as a permanent base. The defending Frankish forces, led by Count Odo, held out for nearly a year in one of the great military epics of the early medieval period. The Viking besiegers deployed sophisticated siege equipment, including catapults and mining operations, demonstrating how far they had evolved from the simple raiders of earlier decades. They wore the same practical clothing that had once been mocked, but now wielded technologies and strategies drawn from multiple cultures. The scale of this Viking force reflected significant changes in Norse society since the first raids on Francia. By the 880s, political consolidation in Scandinavia had advanced considerably. Harald Fairhair had made substantial progress toward unifying Norway, while Gorm the Old had established a strong Danish kingdom. These developments pushed more ambitious men to seek opportunities abroad, not as seasonal raiders, but as leaders of armies seeking territory for permanent settlement. The great army that attacked Paris in 885 included veterans of campaigns in England, Ireland, and throughout the Frankish realms, experienced warriors who had accumulated not just wealth, but knowledge of the lands they now sought to conquer. The Frankish defenders, for their part, fought with desperate courage from behind newly strengthened walls. The Ile de la Cité had been fortified with stone towers, and the bridges connecting it to both banks had been fortified. When the Viking leader Siegfried demanded tribute, Count Odo responded with defiance rather than payment. The siege that followed tested both sides to their limits. According to Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who wrote an eyewitness account in his poem Bella Parisiacae Urbis, Wars of the City of Paris, the fighting was constant and brutal, with Vikings attempting to breach the defenses by land and river. Abbo's account provides vivid details of the siege operations. The Vikings constructed catapults to hurl rocks against the city walls and attempted to fill the river channel with debris to bypass the fortified bridges. They built covered rams to approach the defenses, while protected from missiles launched by the defenders. The Franks countered with boiling oil, massive beams dropped from the walls to crush attacking parties, and sorties to disrupt Viking positions. The most dramatic moment came when the Vikings attempted to bypass the Grand Pont, Great Bridge, by dragging their ships overland around it, a maneuver that demonstrated both their engineering skill and their determination to take the city at any cost. By this time, Viking appearance had ceased to be an object of mockery. Abbo describes the Norse warriors with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, men of the North, terrible in aspect, mighty in battle. Their simple wool and leather garments, once derided as signs of poverty, were now recognized as the practical attire of formidable enemies. More telling still, Abbo notes that some Frankish defenders had adopted similar practical dress, setting aside the finery that had once distinguished their rank in favor of garments better suited to the grim business of war. Count Odo personally led the defense with remarkable energy and courage. When supplies ran low during the winter months, he personally broke through the Viking lines to seek reinforcements, then fought his way back into the city to continue leading the resistance. His leadership inspired the defenders to hold out against overwhelming odds, transforming what might have been a swift victory for the Vikings into a grinding war of attrition. The longer the siege continued, the more the advantage shifted to the defenders as disease and hunger began to affect the massive Viking force encamped around the city. The siege was finally broken when the Frankish Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with a relief army in October 886. Rather than engaging the Viking force directly, however, he negotiated yet another payment of Danegeld, 700 pounds of silver, and offered the Vikings free passage up the Seine to raid Burgundy, which had been in rebellion against him. This cynical political calculation saved Paris but further undermined imperial authority. Count Odo, who had led the defense of the city, emerged as the true hero of the siege and would eventually be elected King of the Western Franks, the first non-Carolingian to hold the title. Charles the Fat's decision to buy off the Vikings rather than fight them represented the culmination of a strategy that had begun with Charles the Bald's payment after the 845 raid. By now, the payment of Danegeld had become an institutionalized response to Viking threats, one that solved immediate problems but created longer-term vulnerabilities. Each successful extortion demonstrated to Norse leaders that threats against Frankish territories could yield substantial rewards without the risks of actual combat. At the same time, each payment further depleted Frankish resources and undermined confidence in imperial leadership. The contrast between Odo's defiant resistance and Charles the Fat's capitulation could not have been starker, and it accelerated the transition from Carolingian to local authority that would define the emerging feudal order. The siege of Paris marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of both Viking and Frankish societies. For the Norsemen, it demonstrated the limits of raiding as a strategy. Despite their impressive force, they had failed to take the city through direct assault. Increasingly, Viking leaders began to consider the advantages of permanent settlement and integration into Frankish political structures. For the Franks, the successful defense of Paris, achieved despite, not because of, imperial leadership, accelerated the shift toward local power centers and defensive regionalism that would characterize the emerging feudal order. The decades following the siege saw significant changes on both sides of this cultural divide. Viking raids continued, but increasingly they occurred alongside more complex interactions. Norse settlers established communities in various regions of Francia, particularly in the lower Seine Valley and along the Loire. These settlers gradually adopted aspects of Frankish culture while maintaining distinctive elements of their northern heritage. Archaeological evidence from these settlements reveals a material culture in transition, buildings that combined Norse and Frankish architectural elements, pottery that incorporated designs from both traditions, and burial practices that reflected an evolving religious identity. On the Frankish side, political reorganization accelerated following the deposition of Charles the Fat in 887. The election of Odo as king of West Francia in 888 marked the formal end of Carolingian rule in that region, though members of the dynasty would return to the throne intermittently in subsequent years. More significantly, power increasingly devolved to regional magnates who could provide effective protection against external threats. These local leaders built castles, maintained private armies, and established hereditary control over their territories, the classic elements of feudalism as later historians would define it. The refined court culture that had once mocked Viking simplicity gave way to a more militarized society focused on territorial defense and local authority. In the decades that followed, the relationship between Vikings and Franks would transform fundamentally. In 911, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte granted the Viking leader Rollo and his followers a territory at the mouth of the Seine that would eventually become Normandy. In exchange for this land, Rollo accepted baptism and swore fealty to the Frankish king Charles the Simple. This arrangement formalized a process already underway, the settlement of Norse people within Frankish territories and their gradual integration into the local cultural and political landscape. The treaty represented a pragmatic compromise by both parties. For Charles the Simple, it transformed a persistent enemy into a vassal who could help defend the realm against other Viking incursions. For Rollo, it provided legitimate title to lands his people had effectively controlled for decades, along with recognition of his authority by the Frankish power structure. The agreement reflected the complex reality that had emerged from nearly a century of conflict. Neither side could achieve outright victory, but both could benefit from accommodation. The very concept of fealty that underpinned the treaty represented a fusion of Frankish political theory with Norse practical alliance building, a hybrid solution to the challenges of governance in a fragmented landscape. The story of Rollo's homage to Charles the Simple illustrates how far both cultures had come from their first hostile encounters. According to tradition, when told he must kiss the king's foot as part of the ceremony, Rollo delegated the task to one of his warriors, who performed it by lifting the king's foot to his mouth, toppling the monarch backward. Whether historical or apocryphal, the anecdote captures the complex blend of accommodation and retained independence that characterized this new relationship. The Vikings had gained legitimate standing within the Frankish world without fully surrendering their distinct identity. Within a generation, the Norse settlers of Normandy had adopted the Frankish language, converted to Christianity, and begun intermarrying with the local population. Yet they maintained distinctive elements of their northern heritage, particularly in military organization and maritime skills. The clothing that had once marked them as outsiders gave way to local fashions, but their reputation as fearsome warriors remained intact. The cultural synthesis taking place in Normandy was replicated, with regional variations in other areas of Viking settlement throughout the Frankish realms. The Duchy of Normandy that emerged from this process represented something new in European history, a political entity born directly from the integration of Norse and Frankish cultures. The Norman aristocracy that developed in the 10th and 11th centuries combined Scandinavian military traditions with Frankish administrative practices. They adopted the French language but maintained distinctive legal customs with Norse roots. They embraced Christianity but organized their church along lines that reflected Scandinavian concepts of authority and territoriality. Even their architecture blended influences, with early Norman churches incorporating decorative elements reminiscent of Viking wood carving translated into stone. By the mid-10th century, the stark contrast between Viking simplicity and Frankish ostentation that had defined their early encounters had largely dissolved. In its place emerged a new cultural reality, one in which Norse pragmatism and martial prowess blended with Frankish administrative traditions and Christian institutions. The resulting hybrid culture would prove remarkably dynamic, as evidenced by the Norman conquest of England in 1066 and the establishment of Norman kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily. The descendants of the simple-clothed Vikings, who had once been mocked at Frankish courts, would go on to create some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated political and cultural achievements. The transformation extended to material culture as well. Archaeological excavations at Viking settlements in Normandy reveal a fascinating evolution in personal items. The earliest layers often contain distinctively Scandinavian artifacts, oval brooches, Thor's hammer pendants, combs of northern design. In successive layers, these give way to objects of mixed influence and eventually to items indistinguishable from general Frankish material culture. The simple woolen garments that had once identified the Norsemen were replaced by local styles, though with occasional distinctive elements that preserved something of their cultural heritage. Linguistic evidence tells a similar story of assimilation and adaptation. The Norse language disappeared from Normandy within 2 to 3 generations after the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, replaced by the local Romance dialect. Yet hundreds of Norse-derived words entered the Norman French vocabulary, particularly terms relating to seafaring, warfare, and land management. Place names throughout the region preserve Norse elements, suffixes like toft, homestead, by farm, and thorp, village, mark settlements established or renamed during the period of Norse influence. Even personal names show this pattern of cultural blending with traditionally Scandinavian names like Rollo and Ragnar, giving way to Christianized forms like Robert and Richard, while retaining distinctive naming patterns. The religious dimension of this transformation was particularly significant. The conversion of Norse settlers to Christianity represented more than a change in theological beliefs. It entailed adoption of an entirely different worldview and social structure. Viking paganism had been non-hierarchical, with religious practices integrated into everyday life rather than institutionalized in a separate clerical order. Christianity, by contrast, brought with it a highly organized church with defined ranks, extensive land holdings, and a monopoly on legitimate religious practice. The adjustments required were substantial, yet by the mid-10th century, the descendants of pagan raiders were building churches and monasteries across Normandy, often endowing them with wealth originally accumulated through plunder. This religious transformation had profound implications for material culture, including clothing. Christian practices introduced new categories of garments, ecclesiastical vestments, monastic habits, attire appropriate for church attendance. The simple functionality of Viking dress gave way to more complex systems of visual signification, with clothing serving to mark not just practical needs, but spiritual status and ritual roles. Illuminated manuscripts produced in Norman monasteries from the late 10th century onward depict figures in clothing that combines Frankish styles with occasional details that hint at Scandinavian influence, a visual reflection of the cultural synthesis underway. For the broader Frankish world, the integration of Norse settlers represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge lay in absorbing a population that had once been viewed as the embodiment of barbarism into the social, political, and religious structures of Christian Francia. The opportunity lay in the martial vigor and practical skills that these settlers brought with them, qualities that could strengthen a society still grappling with external threats and internal fragmentation. The resulting synthesis proved remarkably successful, creating polities capable of both effective defense and ambitious expansion. Looking back across the centuries, we can see that the mockery of Viking dress by the Franks represented a fundamental misreading of their northern adversaries. The Frankish nobility, heirs to Roman traditions of using clothing as social signifier, interpreted Viking simplicity as evidence of cultural inferiority. They failed to recognize that this simplicity masked a formidable pragmatism, one that valued function over display and judged objects by their utility rather than their decorative value. The longships that carried Vikings up the Seine to Paris embodied this philosophy perfectly, stripped of unnecessary ornamentation, engineered for maximum effectiveness, and deadly in their application. The burning of Paris in 845 shattered Frankish complacency and forced a re-evaluation of these northern barbarians that would eventually lead to accommodation and integration. The simple dressed men who had been objects of derision became conquerors, then settlers, and finally contributors to a transformed European culture. The Frankish chronicler Adrivald of Fleury, writing after the 845 raid, reflected this changed perception. They came in their simple garments, but departed wearing our finest silks, having proven that true power lies not in appearance, but in deed. The legacy of this cultural encounter extended far beyond the Viking age. The Norman achievement, which represented the culmination of Norse-Frankish integration, would reshape medieval Europe in profound ways. Norman innovations in castle construction, administrative practice, and military organization drew on both Viking and Frankish traditions. The cultural synthesis they embodied would influence everything from architecture to literature, leaving an indelible mark on European civilization. The most visible manifestation of this legacy was the distinctive architectural style that emerged in Normandy during the 11th century and spread throughout Europe following the Norman conquests. Romanesque churches with massive walls, round arches, and decorative elements that echoed both Roman precedents and Norse wood-carving traditions created a visual vocabulary that expressed the dual heritage of Norman culture. The Tower of London, Durham Cathedral, and countless parish churches across England stand as monuments to this cultural fusion, their stone fabric embodying the strength that emerged from the integration of Norse practical efficiency with Frankish institutional sophistication. In the sphere of governance, Norman rulers developed administrative systems that combined Carolingian concepts of public authority with Norse emphasis on personal loyalty. The feudal contracts that defined political relationships in Norman territories were more precisely articulated and systematically enforced than in other regions, creating a governmental structure capable of projecting power across considerable distances. This administrative efficiency would prove decisive in the Norman conquest of England, where William the Conqueror's government implemented the most comprehensive survey of lands and resources attempted in medieval Europe, the famous Domesday Book of 1086. Military organization reflected a similar synthesis. Norman armies combined heavy cavalry tactics derived from Frankish tradition with infantry deployments that preserved elements of Viking battlefield practice. The Norman knight, encased in mail and mounted on a powerful warhorse, represented the culmination of developments that had begun with Charlemagne's mounted warriors. Yet Norman military leaders retained the tactical flexibility and emphasis on adaptability that had characterized their Viking ancestors, allowing them to adjust their approach based on terrain and enemy capabilities. This blend of discipline and adaptability would prove devastating to their adversaries from Hastings to Antioch. For modern observers, the story of the Vikings and the Franks offers timeless insights into cultural perception and misperception. The Frankish mockery of Viking clothing reflected a common human tendency to mistake superficial differences for fundamental ones, to conflate cultural practices with intrinsic worth. The burning of Paris exposed the hollowness of this assumption in the most dramatic fashion possible. True strength, the Vikings demonstrated, lay not in outward display, but in practical effectiveness, a lesson as relevant today as it was 12 centuries ago. The integration of Norse settlers into Frankish society provides an instructive example of cultural adaptation and synthesis. Rather than maintaining rigid separation or demanding complete assimilation, both sides engaged in a process of selective borrowing and innovation that produced something new and uniquely vital. The Normans who emerged from this process were neither Vikings nor Franks, but a distinctive people who drew strength from both ancestral traditions. Their success in subsequent centuries suggests the potential advantages of such cultural hybridity, particularly in societies facing complex challenges that require diverse perspectives and approaches. As we conclude our journey through this pivotal chapter in European history, the image that lingers is one of transformation. Simple-dressed warriors arriving in dragon-proud ships and departing with a changed continent in their wake. The Vikings came seeking plunder, but ultimately contributed to a profound cultural recalibration. The Franks began by mocking what they did not understand, and ended by incorporating elements of the very culture they had derided. From this crucible of conflict and eventual accommodation emerged a new European reality, one that would shape the continent's development for centuries to come. In the modern streets of Paris, few visible traces remain of that fateful Easter Sunday in 845, when the city went up in flames. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés still stands, though rebuilt many times since its Viking ordeal. The Seine still flows beneath the bridges of the city, its waters no longer carrying the threat of dragon-headed ships from the north. Yet in the cultural DNA of France, in its institutions, and its historical memory, echoes of that encounter between simple-dressed warriors and a sophisticated but vulnerable civilization continue to resonate. The lesson learned so painfully by the Franks, that true strength lies beneath surface appearances, remains as valuable now as it was when Paris burned and the world of Charlemagne confronted its most formidable challenge,